they're well, they're in data track. I don't know whether they're in Mitaco, and nothing I can do about this. Should be revision 01. Use cases, base spec, and okay. Well, I hope it works then. Okay, it's time. See the scroller works here. Why didn't it work in there? Okay, so good afternoon. Let's try it again. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Oh, well done. Everybody's awake. So this is SML session, our second session since we got chartered. I'm Alexei Melnikov, and next to me, wonderful Arndt. Right. So just Arndt. So this is just a reminder about NoteWell. I hope you've seen it before. If you haven't, please make sure you're aware of various documents covering IPR policy, good behavior, and all other things. But the main parts are treat everybody with respect, try to avoid slang and speak clearly, so we have a lot of non-native speakers. And use the best engineering judgment and find the best solution for the whole internet. Right. This session is being recorded. Please use either full Miteco tool, but if you do that, make sure that you're muted so we don't have any echoes, or use the on-site tool. You can only come to the mic whether you are local or remote if you sign in into the tool. Or you have to buy a lot of beers. So we have a note taker. Thank you, Jim. Arndt will just sanity check as well. Okay, sorry, too fast. This is our agenda. I updated it slightly, so I inserted actually. We'll have a very quick presentation on use cases. It's not going to be as extensive as last time because people should be hopefully familiar with various use cases presented. But this is a short update on what's happening in the document. Then the base spec. Oh, sorry. Slide. Base spec, then trust. So use cases and the base spec are accepted as working group documents. Trust and security is not. We know that we need to get it to the point where it will be acceptable. And then confession about structured vacation notices is chairs, which was me at the time, should have issued adoption call for that, but didn't. But we'll carry on discussing it, and Arndt and I will issue adoption call after the session. Any agenda bashing? Okay. Timing is approximate. If we need a little bit more or less on various topics, we'll just see. We'll try to make the most productive session. So you can come up.
All right, can you hear me? Can. Oops. Sorry. So welcome everybody this afternoon to our second structured email session. Yeah, as Alexei said, we will jump right on into it with updates on the use case document. Next slide, please. So the scope of this document, so this is for those who don't recall it in the charter, it's an optional document. It's not necessarily something we must publish in the end, but it's supposed to be cross-cutting to the other documents, so to provide something like a scratch pad, more or less, for collecting use cases, discussing them in order to drive the other specifications. What has been changed since the last IETF? So there have been some smaller editorial changes, elaborations. And I think there is one major thing. So we had, I think at the last IETF, some discussion about security and privacy issues on several of those use cases, which in a way were anticipated because, you know, we have this trust and privacy separate draft, which we will also talk about later on. But somehow I think in that discussion we came to the conclusion it might make sense nevertheless also to address privacy and trust to a certain extent also in the use case document. So the first attempt of achieving that, which you find in the document, is that there is now for each use case discussed in the document some very short elaboration on potential privacy and trust issues. Yeah, next slide, please. And this looks as follows. So you see the example down there. So that is for the location sharing use case, where I can share my my location with other people via structured email, similar like you know it from instant messaging tools. Yeah, so this kind of privacy and trust discussion here is still quite vague in a way. Yeah? So I'm also seeking feedback and input on that probably here, how to make that better. But for instance, yeah, you can easily argue that the privacy level of location sharing is high because it's basically personally identifiable data about your location or your whereabouts. Trust level, so is there any, you know, spamming or something like that, how this can be abused, is probably, there's probably not required to be such a high trust level, because at least I cannot imagine in which way somebody would like to spoil you sending you his or her location. But anyway, it's so the idea of the current state of these points is not necessarily that they are yet completely finished. It's more or less a process of thinking about how could we find some kind of template for discussing these issues. And one other idea that came up and which we will probably discuss then more later on in the privacy and trust document is basically probably to mirror these kind of things. So to have for the individual use cases some kind of framework where we can say, okay, this is probably a high trust or a low trust use case. And then in the privacy recommendations, provide two different means probably for clients depending on the kind of use case and the privacy level required or the trust level required. So for instance, there might be certain information in structured email, sent by structured email, which is not really privacy sensitive, yeah? But there might be other stuff like this location, which is. So one could, for instance, say that for that in the trust draft, so for every use case with a high privacy requirement, this kind of information should be encrypted, for instance. Yeah? So this is probably how these two drafts could interrelate. Yeah, I would be very happy on some discussion here, because I think this is directly coming out from what we discussed in Brisbane. So I would be happy to learn if this is going into a direction that will help us and how we could probably improve this to a certain extent. We can either do it now, or I think there's one more slide anyway.
Are you going to have more examples, right, in the trust and security document? There will be.
Sorry, I didn't get.
Will there be more examples of different trust levels?
In the presentation of
yes, so maybe we can you just introduced the concept, so maybe we can discuss it later when we talk about trust and security.
Either or. I think.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
I mean, if people have immediate
Exactly.
reactions, please.
Okay, so in terms of next steps for this draft, beyond that, as I said, this draft has not even a milestone, I think, even though I think it's adopted in some way, but there is no deadline or something like that. And this, anyway, as I said, is supposed to be sort of a living document to a certain extent. So there might be other use cases, of course, also to be added in here, proposed by other people. One other thing that was proposed, I think, in Brisbane is the question of modeling guidance. So there was, I think, some critique by Pete, for instance, about this copy to clipboard thing, which was quite, made a lot of sense. So one idea was also probably at some point to add a section, a best practice section at the end of the use cases document, putting together some recommendations, but this hasn't been started yet. Yes. And yeah, there were two people, I think, volunteering in Brisbane to co-author, and but we didn't really do so much work on the document, as I said, also because it was not strictly necessary, but still, I mean, if there is somebody really interested in working on this, I think any contribution, also review of the document would be quite nice. And that's it for now, I think.
Other people who volunteered in this room?
Sorry.
Other people who volunteered to help you in this room?
Yeah. If you look at me, it's a little bit confusing too.
Okay. Well, all right, fine. Okay, moving on.
All right, this is the core spec. Next slide, please. I think in Brisbane, we went through this one quite extensively. I think we spent almost an hour or something like that. Yeah, the scope is really, everything besides the security and trust aspects of structured email. So how is the structured email, should it look like? And also what kind of behavior needs to be taken into account when sending structured email to somebody else, replying to it, and so on. I think in general, the aspects of how to put structured data into the email, we have some open issues here to decide in a way, but they are in general, I think, understood. So the trade-offs are understood to a certain extent, and we will discuss about one or two of them in the following. And then there is, I think, some issues, especially those which relate to, the interactive issues of structured email, like replying to it, updating it, and so on, which also in the draft, I think, are not perfectly described yet or well thought through. So I think, especially for people reviewing or looking at this, I think these are also aspects where any kind of feedback and opinion would be super helpful. Yeah, so in terms of updates, again, there were also some editorial fixes in here. Then there was, I think, so those of you in Brisbane remember there was this categorization of how does the structured representation of the email relate to the human readable part. So is it like a partial representation where only a part of the human readable part will be described? Is it a full representation where basically the structured email in total, or the structured data in total, represents the information for the human readable part, which can then be skipped probably by a client capable of it? And one major case that came up also in discussion was that there's, of course, this idea of a non-representation. So in cases where you have structured data which is actually not at all related to the human readable part, and actually the structured vacation notice, which we will talk about later, might be that case if it's like this kind of preemptive structured vacation notice, which is just attached to a regular email. And this kind of non-representation case was now added in a more systematic way. And yeah, there are now 2 surveys started, and we will talk about them now in the next slide. So the idea of these surveys is a little bit there is a problem because we cannot easily look what is already, so there is some structured email already sent around because some ISPs are supporting some kind of lightweight or reduced set of structured email features already. But it's really hard to find out to which extent this is happening because obviously email is private, so there is no public thing we can crawl. Nevertheless, we did some tests with own email accounts initially just to get an initial idea like how many of those structured email exists there. Also, what kind of senders are there sending this? So is it widespread already? Which for the group would probably also be a topic because in terms of being downloads compatible, if a lot of people are already sending that or not. And also which kind of formats are probably used. Yeah? So we have this decision to take on, for instance, supporting JSON LD representation of structured data and or also a microdata representation, which is an inline HTML annotation, which generally is allowed by Gmail right now for their implementation. And so the goal of this survey was basically to gather some data, what is there in the wild. And as you see here, so this is like an anecdotal thing. Yeah, it's not like for many accounts, obviously. What is probably notable also, it was a non-Gmail Yahoo one-in-one account. So it was an account which was for the sender not to be known to be capable of dealing with the structured data. Because you could assume, for instance, that certain senders will just send the structured data right now to whatever Gmail where they know it is supported and strip it from other recipients. So this means that probably this data is underestimating the current situation because some of the senders might have not included it, sending it to that account that was analyzed. And yeah, what we see here is I think the account was used since some 10 years or something like that. So it's, I think, quite a large account. But I think what you can see, I was personally actually surprised to see so many different categories and also vendors in each and every category already using that. It has to be noted probably, I think we had some internal discussion already about that obviously not each and every mail of each of that provider will contain structured data. I mean, this is just a snapshot of the account analyzed. It might also be that only in a given certain amount of time that was used by whoever is listed here. But nevertheless, yeah, I mean, one of the ideas was to see, is that used already by people? Or is there data sent around? And this obviously seems to be the case to a certain extent. But of course, it would be helpful to have more of that information and from more accounts. Which is why we also want to provide some tooling here. So the tool we use for the scanning probably as an open source thingy, and everybody who wants to try that out with some accounts can do that, and then probably share some insights about that. Also, the idea is to anonymize some of the data in case it's privacy related. In order to provide a test data set, because again, this is also a little bit tricky with email because most of these structured emails you will receive will of course be, your flight reservation and things like that. Final thing on the slide is the second bold thing here is, so JSON LD was the majority of structured data formalism used. I would say, I think it was in roughly 60 or 70% of the cases. But there were also a number of vendors, particularly I think it was Google by itself for Google Docs and Google Drive emails using microdata for the structured data. But yeah, as I said, this is a preliminary data here, but I think this is helpful in a certain way for the group, hopefully, in order to drive further decisions. Yeah. Is there questions directly? I see somebody.
Ben needs to leave.
Mm-hmm.
Ben is in the queue and needs to leave.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
He's not in the queue. He's just there.
Didn't I see in the queue?
No.
No, right.
Are you in the queue, Ben? Well, we're trying to figure this out. So what are you asking? Are you going to publish the tool somehow that you're using to extract data from personal?
So you're asking me or you are channeling Ben?
I'm asking you.
Okay. Yeah. So the idea is to publish that tool. Yeah.
Okay. And Okay, so once you publish it, then we can run it on our personal mailboxes and
Hopefully,
find
I mean,
find out some
yeah.
data and Okay, all right. Ben, did you want to say anything? Okay. Vittorio?
No, I just wanted to point out that, yes, if you have a tool that works, we can also see whether some of our big customers might, provided with this fits into their privacy policy, run this anonymously on a higher number of accounts so that we can actually get some data. So please, let's publish the tool and let's have a discussion.
And I think what I also forget to say is the idea is also in the tool to include something like a timestamp probably, so one can also see at which point in time that was included and so on, because that data point was lost in that initial scan. We just know it happened sometime in those 10 years. Yeah.
Okay. Next slide.
Yeah, I'm a little bit lost because so then there is a second survey, so this is about the full representation case, which currently in the core specification is supposed to be a multi-part alternative edition. So most emails will have multi-part plain text and text HTML in many cases nowadays. In rare cases, there is calendar invites also used as a multi-part alternative. And this is probably what mostly multi-part alternative is used in practice. I've personally not seen anything else beyond that, but yeah, there might be other stuff for that. And so I think one major question was here, this full representation case is in a way new because the current implementation by those vendors I mentioned earlier doesn't really distinguish full or partial representation at all. It leaves it implicit. And the question is then now, how do we want to realize the full representation? And we could still keep the structured data as in partial representation in the text HTML body embedded, or as I just said before, doing it as a dedicated multi-part alternative. However, one thing that popped out while doing some trial implementation and so on is that actually a lot of libraries and toolings don't allow easily to add a custom multi-part alternative. Just to give you a particular example, if you want to actually follow certain, if you want to do a testing for Gmail's AMP email, which is a related, kind of related structured email mechanism which uses multi-part alternative, you cannot actually do this with Google Apps Scripts Console because in that API, there is just text HTML and plain text allowed for multi-part, and you have no means to manipulate the whole MIME tree in a way. And if you look in more and more libraries and more tools which you might want to extend, so we have been looking at Outlook, at Thunderbird extensions, these kind of things, you can mainly distinguish cases in which you might not be able at all to access the whole MIME body in order to do something. And if then there is not an explicit method for providing multi-part alternative on text HTML, you don't have any chance, you wouldn't have any chance to build such an email, which obviously is a little bit a blocker in adoption. And you also have to distinguish here actually read and write. So there might be a difference between building such emails versus parsing them. Then there is cases where you have a convenience API for text HTML and text plain. That's actually happening quite often. But you have a fallback on going to the MIME tree. However, of course, that's also sometimes very cumbersome because it would force you as a developer to do the whole MIME multi-part MIME tree building on your own. I think many in the room have been spending painful evenings with these kind of things. Of course, one could try to convince library developers to, improve on that and provide convenience methods on top of that. But still, of course, I mean, there is a lot of programming languages around and so on. So one needs to think about if this is something to be happen soon again or not. And then there might be libraries, of course, which have a very clean and nice convenience method also for multi-part alternative. And the idea was basically to really look a little bit deeper into libraries of certain environments and try to find out if this is a concern or not. And this survey has been started. You find the document linked there, and feel also free to probably put in some notes from the for this library or environment of your choice, because I think many of you might have some experience in certain programming languages where there are certain libraries around. And I think that would be helpful then for the actual decision on how we want to do the full representation in the core spec. As of now, the evidence is like mixed. I think in the document now there is like some 10 to 20 libraries mentioned. It's probably too early to discuss it here in front, and I also didn't prepare a really nice summary of that. But that should be a good starting point to put the decision forward.
Okay, comments? Philip?
Hi, yes, this is Philip. I just wonder, is there another alternative that was discussed, which is to put the representation as a MIME header on probably the multi-part alternative itself, or maybe both of the or all of the alternative subparts. So it's some kind of like content description header.
So, I mean, the mere fact if it's full or partial representation, you could do by that. But the main problem is where to put the actual annotation, and that you wouldn't probably fit into a header, I guess, right?
I mean, I guess depending on the use cases, some of them it seems like it could. I guess maybe that would not be sufficient for all of the use cases, but that might be one possibility to address some of them. I mean, especially I think later in the document, it also mentions you can have an ID that's a CID that references some other MIME part, so that it describes that specific MIME part. So having it as a MIME header on that MIME part seems like a more direct way to do that.
So just to get you right, so what you're suggesting is that in some cases where there is not so much structured data, you could put that into a multi-line header field kind of thing, right?
Right, exactly. So I think one of the use cases was for sending like one-time codes.
Right.
That's a very short description.
So to your initial questions, and I think that particular proposal, to my knowledge, didn't come up yet. Maybe one of the reasons was that we initially started, of course, with the status quo, which is basically this weird, embedding it into the HTML email part. And of course, there is some glory to a certain extent in not being totally incompatible with that and not offering like 20 different versions. This is also why this is still the recommended thing here for the like partial representation thing. And the only reason why we initially thought also about multi-part alternative was that for that full representation, that is sort of like the natural thing to do in terms of the idea of multi-part alternative. This is how that came into place to a certain extent. But yeah, certainly that could be another option. But yeah, one also needs to think about not to confuse the users too far. I mean, yeah.
Right.
And provide too many options. Yeah, that will probably also.
Can I suggest at minimum either send the email to the mailing list just for record, so we can have a discussion, and maybe we'll create a ticket.
I forget to say there is GitHub tickets. They're also linked in the document for most of these particular points, especially also for that one. Even though they are more meant to, because I think they cannot be used for official discussion because this is supposed to be on the mailing list, right?
We can still, track. We use GitHub for
yeah, sure, but at least one should, I think, cross links, and probably I commented here in the ticket or something. I don't know actually how this is typically solved. The idea of the tickets was basically to capture a little bit from the different discussion streams on the mailing list. Yeah. Okay.
So send an email. I'll create a ticket then. We'll do that. Right.
Pete Resnick. So I saw Ben's comment in the chat room about, well, maybe multi-part alternative isn't right, maybe multi-part related, and which doesn't seem quite right to me. But I also saw the comment in the draft about, well, if you've got a full representation, then you should do text plain and text HTML, and you must do, I forgot what you must do. But this starts to seem weird to me
Mhm.
because there are clearly cases where I would want just the structured data to be acted on, and I don't expect anybody to be looking at plain text or HTML. Or maybe I just want to include plain text which says, this is a calendar thing, ignore it if you don't understand it, or whatever.
Mhm.
Mhm.
And alternative, I think as originally envisioned, was you can view whichever one of these is most convenient to you.
Mhm.
So plain versus HTML. If you've got a rich text engine, you can switch to HTML. If you don't, you can use the plain, that'll come first. This seems somehow different, and I can't quite get my head around what the solution here is. But
Solution.
and especially
Mhm.
if you've got engines where you can't see the rest of the MIME structure, right? If that's part of what's driving you to, run into these problems,
Mhm.
maybe, I mean, in addition to being able to put a header in that just has the structured data and that's all you need, but if you've got more complicated structured data, maybe a hint header. There was something that we used to have, like a content dash something.
There was something for voice data.
Yeah,
Yeah.
part of the voice stuff that pointed down into the message, into the right place, that let you know where the thing, if you were interested in looking for this, you don't have to parse the whole thing, go find it.
Mhm.
Yeah, part of VPIM, I think.
Probably, yeah.
And maybe it's worth looking at some mechanism to get around some of this.
So if I understood you correctly, those are two slightly different
Yeah,
things,
it's two
right?
different points, yes.
Yeah. So for the second point about giving an intuition in the header that there's structured data inside, I think there is something like that in the document at a later stage. There is some header field or header information proposed, just for the case also where you retrieve headers in order to know which ones to further analyze. But that what you proposed might be going even beyond that. So you might want to have a look at that.
Yeah, I'll take a look.
And actually, so the rationale, what is currently there between text HTML and text plain as a fallback was mainly based on the assumption that this is like basically what this is supposed to be also for calendaring and so on.
Right.
One can, of course, relax that, but I wonder what will happen then if somebody receives that in a client that cannot deal with that. See an empty mail. I mean, at least in the text HTML part, you see a gibberish HTML mail.
I guess I would just give it softer guidance, and maybe it's still a should,
Right.
but
Okay.
should provide some other part where non-capable clients can
Okay.
use it and not be so specific.
That's a fair point. Yeah. Mhm. Thanks.
Hi, Daniel here. I think the separate MIME part is very interesting for many cases where you just want to automatically parse it, where the user is not necessarily looking at it, because you put it into the HTML. We sometimes see HTML emails where the HTML is 30 megabytes.
Mhm.
And if you have some small thing that just kind of, hey, we just quickly extract this, then you need to parse your way through 30 megabytes. That is not always what you want to do. So I think that's a very strong case, both for full representation, but also when it's not the full representation. Let's say you have a long email with a lot of stuff in it, but there is something in there that you want. Being able to get that without having to decode all of the HTML would be very nice. And I think that sort of ties into the idea of having a header field that you then know, do you even want to bother going through this email and see if there is anything? So I think the library case where a lot of libraries don't support it is obviously interesting, because if nobody ends up using it, there is no point in creating a good spec. But there's also the question of, if there are good use cases, hopefully the libraries will allow adding this. So that's kind of like
that's a very interesting point. Especially on that like efficiency argument, I understood, right? Can you give one level more of detail here? Because in my understanding, even for the multi-part alternative, you need to like if the email is big, you still need to deal with like the 30 megabytes in order to pull out that multi-part alternative, right? I don't
Exactly,
know.
but you only need to scan through it. But with HTML,
Yeah.
you actually have to decode the MIME part
Okay.
into something that an HTML parser
Okay.
can then read.
Uh-huh.
And then you have to run the HTML parser and get to the parts that then have some JSON or
Yeah.
whatever in it, and then feed that to a JSON parser.
Uh-huh.
So you still have to do a lot of like allocate another 30 megabyte buffer
Yeah.
that you then
Okay,
decode that
that's a-
into.
yeah.
So it's more this kind of thing. If you
Super,
can
yeah.
just
Mhm.
scan through the data as is, more or less, and fun, because most of the structured data is going to be kilobytes, maybe even just a few hundred bytes. So being able to do that very efficiently is certainly interesting.
Okay.
Because we already see similar issues with, like on the email client side, being able to show like a snippet where you're going to show the first sentence or whatever. That can be very expensive with HTML email because you need to scan through like a megabyte of HTML stuff that isn't text before you get to the part that actually is the stuff that you want to display. And I would assume that you have a very similar issue here.
Okay.
So because a lot of this is automated email, which
Yeah,
are
yeah.
known for being very heavyweight. Yeah.
Yeah. No, those are very good
So,
points. Thank you.
yeah.
Yeah.
Can I just quickly interject from the up there that in IMAP and JMAP you can download specific body part without downloading everything else. So if there is
Okay, yeah.
so you don't need to download both multi-part, well, all multi-part parts. You can download just one of them that you want.
I totally get it, but often, like from a client perspective, we're often in a situation where we have the email downloaded, and then somebody is like,
Yeah, but
"Hey, what is
there are
missing?"
multiple way to improve efficiency and memory usage and stuff like that. Yes.
Yeah, but
I would have made a similar point because you're assuming now is there's an IMAP connection, but it might also be some case where you have
JMAP.
local or something. I mean,
Yeah.
Ken Murchison, I don't have a strong opinion on whether it should be multi-part alternative or its own MIME type, but I do want to add my +1 to Philip and Pete and Daniel, where I think there should be a top level, maybe a structured header that can either contain the data itself as it's small enough, or it provides a content ID to the exact part that actually has the ID, or has the data rather. We did something like this for IMAP a while back. Didn't get wide adoption, but in practice, it worked quite well, where rather than having to search through to find iCalendar data, there was a top level header that actually said, this is where to go find it. Now, most email clients were already used to searching for it, so they didn't really adopt the header, but in practice, it worked quite well.
can you read the reference? Was it IMIP?
IMIP, yeah.
Okay.
Cyrus Debu wrote a draft.
Okay.
I don't know if Apple actually did it or not, but in practice, it worked.
Maybe if you have it in mind or find it, can post it in the.
Can
chat.
you post it to the mailing
I'll
list?
see if I can find it.
Thanks.
Hi, Daniel Kahn Gilmore. So I just wanted to also push in the direction of the multi-part alternative approach or a structured header. I don't think that actually, I've been learning recently about just how flexible you can be in terms of what you can stuff into the headers. It's remarkable how much stuff, and if we're really talking about a kilobyte of data, I think that actually fits. But I don't, like, I share the reservations that other people have expressed about having to have, well, first having to parse an HTML part, but also just having to have an HTML part in order to parse out the structured data seems like a potential mistake. Like I don't necessarily want to send text HTML if I don't need to, and maybe my message has other bits that I can do. So it strikes me as a better approach to avoid depending on text HTML. And also, I wanted to mention that you're talking about easy, difficult, impossible here for the support. I think it would be good to try to characterize this as easy, difficult, impossible for the generation.
Yes,
for the
it's a
handling.
sender side versus, yeah.
Because if it's hard to generate, people will just switch to tools for generating their mail that can handle it if they want to generate it. I'm not as worried about that. If it's actually hard to consume, then then the discussion gets a little bit different, right?
Actually, I didn't mention that. I mean, in most cases where I looked at, I think it was more or less, it didn't make such a big distinction because, where it mattered that you could create and read it in the same tool or library, it was basically, done by the same concepts.
Well, but there are going to be fewer people initially generating this stuff.
Sure.
Right, and they'll be able to find the tools that they want to use. The question is there a deployed base of recipients that are going to have a hard time adopting this because their stack is so ossified that they can't pluck out the alternate form?
I mean, I would make a slight remark here because I think one of the attempts we are also doing is like to also allow people to send structured email within their tools. So I would not just say, sending is a matter of specialized tools only, which I sort of understood you were making the point for, right?
No, I think what I'm trying to say is not that it's a matter for specialized tools, but that if your goal is to send, then you have the incentive to pick a tool that will let you do the sending. Whereas people don't understand that they might even be receiving this, and they might not be willing to move their mail clients for the sake of receiving such a message, right? I think the incentives are different so it's worth splitting those perspectives out.
Fair point,
Philip again. Just to add a little bit more on the HTML bit, I think there's also some security considerations where, when you're receiving an email but the mail client is not in the foreground, you may not want to parse the HTML. And when you do it, you may want to do it in a separate, more tightly restricted process. So that adds, additional overhead as well. So just throwing a bit more on against the HTML.
Thanks.
Lyndon again. I would really like to see that we have the ability to specify this as its own standalone MIME part for a couple of reasons. For our use case, most of the time it would make a lot more sense if we had that as its own separate blob that we could parse and deal with separately, but we would want to be able to reference that from inside the HTML message body itself. And if it's set off separately, a CID takes care of that, and we don't have to rework all of our HTML goop for the most case. There may be times when it does make sense to plop it into the message body, but for us, I think those would be fairly rare. I'm still trying to wrap my head around the security implications that go along with this, because what we would use this for is for the form submission service that we have that's typically used by healthcare offices where doctors will pre-screen, pre-collect a whole bunch of information from their patients before they set up an appointment. This is extremely private data, and we have to be able to unambiguously flag this with a security policy that says, don't you dare send this outside the Hushmail ecosystem. I think that's going to be easier if we split that off into a separate MIME part. But again, I really have to think about this, and I need to take it back and talk with our developers too and see what they say about that. But and I'm not sure the multi-part alternative actually makes sense to me. I don't get it in my head how you'd use something like that, but seriously consider making a separate blob an option here. That will make this thing much more useful, I think, in the general case.
Thanks.
All right. Next.
Queue is closed, yeah, I think. Yeah, so these are the points basically from which I said at the beginning. So that wraps up more or less the part of like how to represent the structured data in the email, which we now discussed. And these are more or less certain implications mentioned in the document for like, dealing with those emails and dynamically. Like for instance, I received an email with structured data and it probably fits very well to the example you just made. I forward it to somebody else. Which kind of data should probably be stripped or prohibited, these kind of things. Yeah. Yes. And yeah, this is why it's of course addressed in a way already in the spec, but as I said, these points more or less need a little bit more discussion. So I think that's, I'm not sure if it makes sense to talk through all of them again, because we did that already in Brisbane. But probably there is a call out to everybody also to have a look at the document here, read through this, and I think there is also a lot of unknowns probably behind those different aspects, because just to make one example, there is a difference once we deal now with structured data, because imagine you have, for instance, an information about an email about a flight going on, right? And there is an update of the flight email. Right now, if it's a human readable message, the sender can very easily, do a red text on top. This is your flight is updated. This is updated information, and the recipient clearly understands what's going on. If you have structured data within that email, and we assume now the full representation case, so the email client will just show the structured data of that flight information. Of course, there needs to be a way for the email client to understand that that second email coming in with updated structured data overrides the first. Yeah? And what I now described is a very simplistic view of that. Yeah? So there might be all sorts of implications of that for maybe also different use cases. So this is why I think we need to think more about these things as well. Probably not also at this time necessarily, because these things we discussed earlier obviously are also more important for the baseline to have decided, like, how does the structured data get into it. But still, I think these things are also important to consider, and would be great if some people could provide something on the list here and some more input on these points. Okay, next slide from my side, if there is no. Yeah, so that brings us to the last slide of this presentation. So as I said, I think one of the main focus right now is to get more information, and I think the discussion today was also very helpful on that, more of a feeling of people really implementing these things, like what kind of solutions they would prefer in order to parse all these kind of things. So I think that were very helpful input here. We have that survey probably where we can also get another perspective on this. I think we will probably also look a little bit more into existing examples and provide this kind of tool for scanning. I will send it around on the mailing list in the next couple of weeks, probably. There was actually one additional cross-cutting aspect that was mentioned this week on the mailing list, and I'm looking at Trent probably if he wants to step in at that point shortly. Who was making that point, that might be something also to even add in addition to the core draft, if that is deemed to be an interesting use case. So I see him already in the line, so I think we can give him the key.
Yeah, all right. Yeah, thanks for bringing me into the room. You probably all saw this on the mailing list, but I think that a key aspect is going to be provenance, because as has been talked about already. So there are various different contexts in which an attached structured, bit of structured information is going to be added along the queue, and I think differentiating between the author, right? I created the message, and I want to put, like dragging an image into the mail. I want to put this structured data in. Versus the client that goes, wait a minute, hey, I'm going to do some artificial intelligence thoughts for you, and I'm going to put the, some sort of structured content in here, but the author didn't know. And then similarly, every step along the chain, whether it's the sending mail server, the any MTA in the middle, or even the delivery agent could insert stuff, right? So I think that carrying along who put it in, so that the receiver can make some sort of clever decisions would make sense. So anyway, that was the thought. Hopefully that is what you were trying to get out of me, Hans-Jörg.
Next. May I? Yeah. I don't see the queue, so it's a little bit different. So Trent, as I already wrote on the list, I think what made that remind me of was, I think, a discussion we had maybe at the BOF also. which was about that some ISPs are currently also, if there's no structured data in an email, do automatic extraction of structured data and store this also in a certain way. And this might also be added then to the email. And would be, in my opinion, a similar case like you mean here, because the provenance would then also be like auto-generated in comparison to it was intentionally added to the email by the sender. So I think in general, this is certainly a valid point. And I think I also wrote in my response on the list that there is at least in that structured data environment some approaches on how to deal with that. So maybe we can come up here with some suggestion or example at some point. What I think would be helpful to have from you also in terms of to have a complete use case for this. I think you had something particularly in mind that I think would be very helpful also to understand if a proposed solution would fit onto that. And maybe another question I would have, either to you or to the room, is I think these aspects which you mentioned are not new in a certain way, that there is also headers currently added downstream by various parties, and all this kind of stuff, all these provenance issues you theoretically have right now already in at least some scenarios. So I wonder a little bit if there's any experience from that, what worked well, what didn't work that well, which we can take into account when considering how to deal with that for structured email. I don't know if anybody has an opinion on that or input. Like certainly there are, I think, headers added by MTAs and so on. Is that an issue? Because usually there is, okay, there's certain signatures sometimes which allow you to derive who added it, but that's not always the case, right? Sometimes I think there is, I'm obviously not an MTA guy, but I know, for instance, that sometimes also on incoming, there are certain headers cleared out to make sure these headers, like, for instance, authorized keys headers or something like that, that this is not spoofed by the external or something like that. So it seems to me that there is also a lot of ad hoc solutions applied right now in practice, right?
If you're worried about random stripping of other fields, I think it's depending on context, might or might not be a problem. It's not actually that common. There are some solutions that do that.
Yeah. I was just wondering if there already have been ideas on how to deal with provenance in these scenarios.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Trent, back in the queue again.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, speaking to that, it seems to me that the best place to put the provenance information, and then similarly the signature, if you want to put it there, right, for verification purposes, or or if it's encrypted, whatever, would be as close to the data itself as possible. And there's also going to be multiple. I can foresee, and I'll write this all up in the use cases. So thank you, Alexi. I will write it up. But I think that the if different MTAs or different parts of the pipeline modify different parts of that or add different context to the message using this mechanism, each of them is going to want to say, well, this is my part. I wrote this part, and then I wrote this part. And then putting that up in a header somewhere, even if cross-referencing it, I think would be, just be harder to put back together. So my suggestion would be to keep the provenance information as tightly packaged into the part as possible.
All right.
All right. Shall I? Next slide.
Oh, yeah, that was the next final slide.
Nobody else in the queue. So. Oh.
Yeah, we don't need time.
Is that it?
That's it, yeah.
Okay.
There's an obvious call for co-authors again also here. I think Alexei also last time volunteered to do a little bit on the document, but still I think there is, if somebody really wants to get involved here, that would be great. And of course, any kind of contribution feedback is good here.
Okay.
Music is being shared.
Let me find. Oh no, there is only one version. That's fine. Never mind.
In Brisbane, I took over the trust and considerations document because Hans-Jörg typed too much, wore his fingers down, and I changed it. Next slide, please. It's uploaded now with more words from me and with a substantive change of focus. We do have structured email today. Hans-Jörg scanned his mailbox, I scanned mine. I pretty much rewrote the first 2/3 of the document to describe what kind of trust and considerations apply today, which is a simple description of current state. For example, what is actually done for calendar invitations instead of what people should be doing. I think this might be controversial, but I held the pen, so I wrote it my way. I also added a bit of examples to try and make things clearer. Next slide, please. We have, I think, 4 kinds of structured mail now. We have random kinds that everyone is parsing, primarily calendar invitations. Then we have 3 big ISPs that process roughly the same kind of structured email. It's possible to send mail to all of them, but it's not quite the same. I tried to describe what they are doing in common rather than prescribe what they should be doing. I feel so small. Open source, I didn't even try. The Kmail Nextcloud people will actually follow what we write. So I didn't see any reason to describe what they are doing. Morg, I'm not there, didn't even try. I'm not sure whether I got around to it, but we do have different processing of the 2 kinds of structured email that Gmail processes. We have some things that are really alternative to a human readable thing, where you can get mail from Lufthansa with a text in HTML, and as an alternative, a structured booking confirmation. That can be processed on receipt. When it arrives on the server, it's possible to process it. Gmail also has microdata which really goes into one email part and doesn't correspond to the entirety of the message. You can tag an address mentioned in running text as being an address. This is impossible to process on retrieval, really, because it needs to be read by the user. It's part of a human readable thing. Next slide.
Do people have comments on this slide? Yeah? Yeah, Daniel?
Yeah, Daniel, it's a bit of a random comment. I don't know if it really fits in here, but I think one interesting thing about required DKIM SPF is for a mail client that displays a message to the user, you want to sort of validate, is this message really, you basically want to do DKIM validation, but should DKIM validation be done on this by a mail client and these kind of things? I think that's sort of a topic that we need to look at some point.
Right. In this document, I pretty much wrote that it is done because, as I see it, it is done.
Yeah,
For
but
better or worse.
for better or worse, but it's also, there are a lot of technical issues with doing those kind of things on the client side, because
Absolutely.
As was mentioned earlier, mail clients typically download MIME paths separately from each other and then recombine them. And at that point, the DKIM may not validate. And there are all kinds of, DKIM wasn't really made for that purpose. So there are lots of weird things that we at some point
Yeah,
need
it
to look at.
depends whether the DKIM signature covers the body or just a specific header field. So, and some of it is used more or less. Yeah.
Are you suggesting that the document should talk about the relationship to, what's it called, authentication results, which is a header?
That's probably that as well. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's just kind of those things sort of like, if you want to trust the structured data, can you use that? Should you use that? I think it doesn't really work. It works if you process that data on the server, but on the client, that could very likely fail. And so there are lots of things like, do we need something else where we just kind of sign just the structured data, which would get us into a lot of trouble. But I think there was a lot of subtle complexity there.
I think. Okay, then sit down. I think that you're saying that that at least the trust and consideration should say something along the lines of check DKIM on the way in. I'm not sure. I'll try to find some wording there. I'll try to find some wording.
Daniel Kahn-Gilmore, I think this is the part where I'm supposed to say end-to-end cryptographic protections enthusiast or something like that. Yeah, so not only is DKIM challenging for the reasons that Daniel raised, but DKIM is challenging also because DKIM and SPF are only guaranteed to be valid at delivery time, which may be entirely different from when the mail user agent receives them. And there's additionally a privacy leak of doing DKIM lookups on any given message. It creates a sort of a web bug situation, like a read receipt that you may not be intending to do. So I think it would be a big mistake if this said that the client needs to do DKIM or SPF, A, because it wouldn't work, and B, because it introduces new problems. I do think that we might want to think about how we talk about it with ARC, or I don't know the different pieces well enough, but if you want to trust your mail transport agent to identify that, yes, this DKIM signature was good, and they want to inject that into the message, and you want to verify that, that seems plausible. But the real thing that I think we would like to say is you should, if you're not sure that this is coming from who it's coming from, you should be looking for end-to-end cryptographic signatures on the message. And if your mail user agent breaks the message as it downloads it and you can't check that, then that's a problem with the mail user agent. Yes, all of that, I think it might be worth putting into the document. I hope I didn't just volunteer myself to write in a couple paragraphs.
Question. Are you talking about a mail client that doesn't trust its server, really?
This is Daniel Kahn-Gilmore. I'm always talking about mail clients that don't trust their servers. I think mail servers are generally untrustworthy. In fact, when we say, how does Gmail do this? My partner recently received an email message and turned to me and said, was looking at their calendar on Google Calendar and said, why do I have this flight from city X to city Y? I don't understand. And that was because Gmail had ingested a forwarded message from my father that he had CC'd to both of us that included his travel itinerary. So, I mean, modeling us after what these guys do is not necessarily going to land us in the best spot.
May I request that you send me a note about that CC? No.
This is Philip. Just a quick comment. I think somebody just said if the mail client doesn't trust its mail server, not every mail client is necessarily bound to. It belongs to the same organization as whatever server it's connecting to. So I think that's been kind of just a general problem for Apple Mail, but I'm sure for Outlook and many other clients where. So I think the authentication results header was also brought up, maybe not on the mic, but parsing that header, has similar problems because you can't necessarily trust that it was inserted by the party that you by your mail provider, right? In practice, I assume the most major mail providers should be stripping fraudulent ones, but you just can't really know.
Wow.
All right, shall we move
Next
on?
slide. This one had me scratching my head, and hopefully it will make you scratch yours. I give examples of most of them. I give examples of all of them actually in the document. The examples shouldn't be controversial. How serious each of these kinds of concerns is maybe discussed, so I sort of slid around that. To my mind, how serious a particular concern is really for each implementer to decide. Divergence is a considerable question. We had an example from DKG about that now. In the human readable, it's obvious that this is someone else's flight. Next slide. No, Philip first.
Yeah. Philip again. I guess just one question is the concern of forwarding, these types of content, is that captured in the document already, or is that one of the more types that should be added?
Try again.
So I guess the security and privacy concern of having structured data forwarded on to, like, for example, if I send my location to somebody and then they forward that email on to someone else,
right.
I'm concerned about that.
Some of that is captured, but I have at least 2 new things that need capturing from this week.
And there is either at least maybe a ticket, and there is definitely text in the base spec about this. So this is still an unresolved issue, what the recommendation is. Yeah.
It's a partially resolved issue, I should say.
I would question that actually, but.
Okay. Yeah. Automatic processing is considerable problem, needs to be thought about carefully, and to my mind, it needs examples in this draft. DKG's example there is great.
Okay, Ben?
So thank you, Arne, for collecting all this information, what is currently being done. But I concur with you that what is currently being done is not necessarily the best way to do things. For example, trusted senders, I'm not sure that's really a meaningful criteria that helps in these particular threats. For example, if it's a trusted sender, I don't want to send a ping back. I don't want to tell him when I read the message that I read the message. So I don't want to have external sources being loaded, even if it's coming from a trusted sender, because he might be putting images from I don't know where, or I don't want him to track me, even though I trust this person. So I think a more useful mechanism would be user interaction. to require user interaction before any action happens. And that would have solved this case with the flight from somebody else being put in your calendar. I think that's pretty crazy. I think Exchange does that as well. When I'm receiving an invitation, it immediately ends up in my calendar. I'm surprised that no spammers have used that. But what I would expect as a user, that I actually click on it before it's added to my calendar. So that would probably stop most of the or many of the problems or the security problems being mentioned here. And I have another comment after this. I'll let you say.
I would just say I agree completely. It's there's a swamp of trust problems. No, not trust problems, of appropriate action problems. It's kind of not obvious that you don't want to add your parents' flight to your calendar, because parents might expect that. Right. As Jim put it, they want you to pick them up at the airport. Makes sense. It's difficult. I'd like to get on to a later slide where the big gaping issue of who is a trusted sender, from whom do you accept things, that comes, so let's skip it right now. I see Michael in the queue.
Michael, very quickly, if you...
Yeah, sorry. Real quickly, I mean, I'm listening to this and I read the draft, and I don't see how this is all that much. I don't see how this is tied to structured mail. This is just mail. This is the problems you listed here. I was dealing with clients, writing a client 20 years ago. I mean, these are all valid, but what here is different than a client that was trying to be smart 20 years ago? Maybe it's a little bit easier to parse the data, but it's still, I don't see anything in here that's novel, my opinion.
Right. There is a difference in degree here, which to some extent becomes a difference in kind. When you can, for example, use a civ action to act on your mail automatically, and it's structured well enough that a civ script can pick it up, then you may not have thought very carefully about what that civ script should do. It's just more powerful tools exposing functionality to people who haven't thought about it that carefully. The Gmail developer who added a CC, well, most of us will have thought less carefully about it than that developer. So I think that the difference in degree becomes a bit of a difference in kind. We do need this document. Pete?
Or Ben was first.
Ben's first.
Sorry.
Quickly.
Yeah, basically what Michael said, I would actually rephrase that whole question of trust or security problems is what is worse than HTML, because we live with HTML already today. I don't see a lot in structured data that would be worse than the problems that we have with HTML. We have already a ton of problems there, and we need to deal with them somehow. And I don't see a lot that goes on top of that. So maybe that's a good perspective to.
Shall I?
I can if you want.
Well, I would say that I largely answer, except what I just said about more powerful tools making a difference in kind. But generally, the issues of trust, I agree that they apply just as much to HTML mail as it does to structured mail. So the trusted sender stuff becomes difficult for me. Pete.
So to answer Ben, I think the difference really is we've learned quite a bit about HTML. And so we do things in MUAs like sandbox. We do things like block certain kinds of HTML from being produced to the user automatically, where this is a new mechanism that has a whole new set of things that the MUA could magically decide to do automatically that they hadn't learned about in the past. That crap is going to be coming through that you've never seen before, that you might think, oh, I'll just execute that piece of code against this structured piece of data. And I think it's important for us when we come up with these new technologies to each time say, new thing here, when we switched from plain text to international text, you might be screwing up a data terminal. When you switched from international text to HTML, you might have running code in the JSON. When you switch to SML, you've got a whole mess of new stuff too. So I think it's worth saying.
I didn't say that.
This is Hans-Jörg. Just very quickly adding to Pete's argument, I think that it's also just a formal consequence of the chartering process that there was a lot of requests to discuss security and privacy, which is why this was supposed to be a document a working group should provide. So this is just also a formal obligation for us to discuss it. If the result in the end, obviously,
it's our moral obligation to provide.
Sorry? Yeah.
It's our moral obligation to provide
that's
it.
We can
my
be
question is
trusted
a
to
little bit
produce
what Michael's actual proposal is. I mean, that at times the discussion can, of course, be relating to both. Maybe is the case, but we don't know yet what comes out in the end, and what else should we do?
Yes, what else can we do?
Do you remember how many slides you have left?
3, I think.
We're probably not going to get to vacation, but okay, fine.
Go on, I'll be quick. Content encryption. I'm kind of got stuck on that because if you can't see the structured data, what kind of vetting can you do at delivery time? So much of the automatic processing, I find this part really difficult. And then there's the question of trust. I describe some of what people are doing now, not happy with that in this case. Just trusting people with whom you have a signed contract is, to my mind, unacceptable. We need something better here. I invite suggestions. Everyone add themselves to the queue. It's closed.
Oh.
Okay. In that case,
it's now open. Go.
People can still add themselves to the closed queue. It's just like up to the chair to decide whether I let them in or not.
Yeah, just looking at the use cases document. Oh, this is Philip, by the way. I think we definitely shouldn't require any kind of encryption. I mean, some of these use cases don't require any, right? Like if you're just sending newsletters or something, that's not, you know, necessarily private or needs to be secured like that. So I don't want to close us off to you know, potential use cases, because with encryption, especially, you know, if we're encrypting the full message, that also comes at the trade-off, like was mentioned earlier, you know, you're going to have to download the full message to be able to pull anything out of it. So I think there's some trade-offs there that for some of these use cases, you know, you might not want to take in the direction of full encryption.
Oh, well, actually, I described more or I thought about more of the security aspects of having something encrypted there that you're going to act on. But obviously, encrypting it protects it as well. Complicated.
Yeah. Is it on one of your slides that basically, yeah, there are potentially multiple levels of sensitivity of the data. So you, depending on it, you might choose to encrypt it or not. And then, yeah, as you said, there is also implications if you choose to encrypt it on the receiving side.
Daniel?
Daniel?
Yeah, I think it's sort of, oh, sorry, Daniel here. It ties back to what we talked about earlier, that if you can already today send calendar invites and boarding passes and all these kind of things to people by email, and this would be another way. And if you have something that needs to be encrypted, you need email encryption, and I don't think we need to invent yet another way of encrypting your emails for this. I mean, it's not that the current email encryption works particularly well, but I don't think we're going to do better.
No, I don't think anybody is suggesting to invent a new way of encrypting things.
Okay.
It's just that you might need for some cases to do that, to encrypt with existing tools, yes.
Would it be acceptable to everyone to add text to the draft saying that encryption is regarded as an email issue and has nothing to do with this particular kind of email content?
Yeah, I think that's very good. I think the one thing that is very interesting is the topic that we touched upon earlier, where it's more sort of a DKIM thing, which is also very difficult. But I think we also need to mention the problems that we talked about earlier is you as on the receiving end need to decide, are you trusting the place where you got the thing from? And I think it's very important to call that out. We're not going to solve that problem. I think it's important to call out that this email may say it's fully authenticated without it actually being that, and you need to decide, do you want to tell the user, or are you just automatically adding everything to the address book or calendar or whatever, or do you want to ask the user? Because there might be use cases where it's totally fine to automatically process these, but we don't know because it really depends on the end user.
You're really listing problems with which I struggle without telling me the answer.
No, but I think it's just, I think the answer is to call out that the client needs to think about these issues and solve them, and it's nothing we can't tell them what to do.
I'll do that and give example messages abbreviated example messages to make people think.
Yeah, I think that's the best we can do.
Next, I think that's then the last.
This is the other Daniel, Daniel Kahn-Gilmore. So you may want to point to a draft that is coming out from LAMPS soon, which is draft IETF E2E mail guidance that offers cryptographic guidance on how to do end-to-end cryptographic protections, either signatures or messages. We have done a terrible job for the last 30 years of doing that, but the only way to solve that is to try to actually solve it, and that's where that work is happening, and this draft does not need to solve that problem here. It can point to that work.
Yep. Please send me a link.
Oh, next. Hold on, sorry, I'm trying to do multiple things. I'm doing it badly. Trent?
Yeah, just one thing. I think there's, and I might be confusing this. This might be my problem. So I think there's a lot of talk about using DKIM for the authentication, and I think that's great. I mean, DKIM is for authentication of the message itself, right? The integrity of the message, and to some degree, the identification of the sending domain. But I think that there's also a piece that might be being conflated here, and that is the integrity and verification and maybe even encryption of one data element or a set of data elements or the entire SML package. And I think they're separate concepts. I would be interested in at least allowing, if not enabling, the encryption and signing at a per element basis within the structure. So hopefully I'm not overly confusing things, or maybe it's me being confused.
Question. Do you regard a multi-part alternative that has a text HTML and an equivalent text LDJ, no, not text, something application LDJSON? Do you regard those as different in trust terms?
I do personally, because again, this goes back to, maybe this is my hobby horse. I'm interested in the concept of multiple entities being able to decorate the message with SML structured data, right? So at some point, someone's going to put different data in there, and I could foresee different data elements having different levels of security control wanting to be applied. As an example, one data element within a JSON LD representation might be perfectly fine, and in fact might be a good idea for it to be in the clear. But then a sub element or another element, you might want to encrypt that so that only one party or another that has the key, the private key or whatever, can decrypt it. So I can see that we wouldn't want to treat, in my opinion, right? My opinion is I wouldn't want to treat all of the SML structured data as either being in the clear or encrypted. I'd rather see it in, allow for, if not enable, the encryption at the per element level. Hopefully that answers your question.
I suppose it does. Jim?
Jim Fenton. I get a little bit nervous when I see trust and DKIM kind of used in the same sentence because
Me too.
because we were very careful in defining DKIM, trying to make sure that people didn't say, "Oh wow, this is a great place for key storage, and we're just going to use it for all these encryption things as well." DKIM keys aren't required to be stored in DNSSEC signed zones and so forth. And it's just enough trust in order to kind of give you a good indication of the provenance of a message, and it kind of stops there. And I hope that using DKIM in this context, we aren't trying to imply that it's any stronger than that.
I see what you are saying. I would ask the same question again. Is there any difference between text HTML that says, hey, this is your flight, and the structured data in a multi-part alternative structure that says the same thing?
It does. There are new use cases. I mean, I think in that particular use case, somebody gets an invitation, we're kind of used to that. But in the structured mail case, I think we're looking at some additional use cases that might have stronger needs.
Right. I myself said something about civ actions earlier today, a difference in degree becoming a difference in kind. Still, I would really like this document to just say that a lot of servers, a lot of mail receivers check DKIM on the way in and use that to decide whether to accept the message or not, but not really connect DKIM to an individual body part.
Right, but I mean, they don't even use it to decide whether to accept the message or not. They just use it along with a whole bunch of other factors to make a decision.
Yep.
So it's
use it to decide whether to. Yeah.
Okay, just a warning. We have 2 minutes left.
Daniel Kahn Gilmore again. Trent, I just wanted to push back on your notion of part-wise cryptographic protections.
What wide protection?
Part-wise, meaning individual parts being signed or encrypted compared to the rest of the message. We've been thinking about this a lot over in LAMPS, and it's pretty scary, and users don't know how to reason about it. I mentioned in the chat that we used to use HTTPS for websites only for the credit card entry form or only for the login. And we discovered very early on, although it took us like 15 years to sort it out, that doesn't actually work, right? The users can't distinguish between these things. You don't get the sorts of protections that you're looking for unless you encrypt at the scale that the users are capable of considering. So please, I beg you, this draft, if you're going to push for part-wise cryptographic protections, do it somewhere else and don't do it in this draft, because there are other folks who want to do that. I can see some advantages to it, but it needs to be thought out as a separate project, not as part of that's snuck into SML.
Right. You would like me to add an example of how part-wise protection can confuse people? Yep.
I very much agree with this, and I think we should just say anything, signing anything is not part of this.
Can I use the last second to call for adoption? This is an individual draft still. It has to become a working group draft or else turned down. So I might use the last few seconds to call for adoption as a working group draft.
Yes, but we can.
Oh. Okay.
Shall I do a poll? Do people want a poll?
No, I'll send Made on the list.
Okay. You lost the chance. Damn it. I wanted to play with the tool.
It's the new shiny. Oh.
Well,
this is like different levels.
You kind of mentioned.
Let's just say that we ran out of time and don't treat this today.
Okay. All right. Well. Okay. Do people feel that we have a bit more meat with the document that we can adopt by the working group? Because I think people agree that we need something in this space, but is this getting closer to what we can start working in the working group now? Some nods? Okay. Okay. Well, obviously, we still need to do an adoption call. Sorry, I'm just doing what I wanted to do with the tool by just asking the question. Okay. So, well, obviously the document nowhere near to being done, but it's in a better shape now by the sound of it. So
the first half is better than the last half. Last half is where this trusted senders stuff is difficult.
All right. Thank you all. Well, I suppose we'll talk about vacation draft next time, or maybe Hans-Jörg actually, you can send him an email to the mailing list summarizing recent changes and asking people for.
Yep.
Okay. All right.
Murray, did you want 30 seconds on the mic?
Yeah. Just to remind everybody, please keep chattering on the list. When I notice the list has gone dead between meetings, I get very nervous. So none of this, it's chat. None of this stuff, like the conversations are happening elsewhere. Like, no. Do it so we can see it.
Okay.
Otherwise, I have to deal with Roman.
Okay. Thank you all. See you online. Yeah, it does help, to just yeah.